Peppa and George happily jumped in a muddy puddle. When they got home, Mama Pig asked Peppa to go to the attic for a jar of jam. The attic was dark and dusty. At the end of the room, Peppa saw a jar, but nearby stood a strange old lamp she had never seen before. Curious, she picked it up and took it to George. She eagerly rubbed it. Suddenly, the room filled with swirling mist, and a skeleton-like silhouette appeared before her, wearing a hat, boots, and holding a cane. Peppa and George were very frightened, but they realized it was a genie. Peppa made a wish for herself. The creature grinned eerily and said, "At your service." Meanwhile, Mama and Papa Pig were busy. Mama was making jam and Papa was working in his study. They had no idea what was happening in the nursery. Peppa wished that no one would ever tell her what to do and that she could do whatever she wanted. George, trembling, exclaimed, "Peppa, why are you making that wish?" Suddenly, the creature disappeared, and happy Peppa ran to tell her parents about her adventure. But when she entered the study, no one was there anymore. The kitchen was also empty. Mammy and Daddy Pig had vanished. Panic seized Peppa. She quickly ran back to the nursery to cancel her wish. When the creature reappeared, Peppa and George were horrified. Their parents, wrapped in thin tentacles, were trapped under the creature's ribs. It grinned eerily. Peppa demanded everything be undone, but the skeleton only smirked. "Silly piglet, now you are all in my power." Suddenly, their house found itself in another world where only darkness reigned. Now they were new residents of a creepy lamp. Deleted Peppa Pig episode, The Living Toy. George loved his dinosaur, but that day, the toy fell into a place where it shouldn't have gone. George didn't know. Some toys find their owners on their own. When George disappeared, Peppa decided to look for him, but she had no idea. She would have to search not for her brother, but for what had taken him. The trail led to the nursery, where it all began. The door to the nursery swung open, and Peppa saw a giant dinosaur holding George in its claws.
"Give him back!"
Peppa shouted, but the dinosaur already knew his name. Peppa tried to rescue her brother, but the dinosaur swatted her away with its tail. George mumbled. His voice sounded strange, as if the dinosaur was learning how to be him. Peppa grabbed a toy hammer and struck the dinosaur's paw. It dropped George.
"Run!"
Peppa yelled, but George didn't move. His eyes turned red. In the morning, George returned, but Peppa saw that now the dinosaur was always watching him. At night, a voice was heard behind the door.
"The little dinosaur. Mine."
He waiting, because children can be lost so easily, especially when they think they've been found. George started drawing strange pictures. In each one, a creature with a round head and white eyes, no arms, no legs, just a body. "It comes at night," George whispered. "I saw it." Peppa didn't believe him, but that night she woke up. And in the corner of her room, something was lying there, a huge round head. It didn't move, but it was breathing. When she turned on the light, it vanished. The next night, her flashlight went out. She heard something crawling under the bed, no footsteps, just a sticky sliding sound. Peppa looked down, and it was there, face inches away, head round, eyes white. In the morning, George's eyes had turned completely gray. He didn't speak. He just stared at Peppa, and then it came again. From the wall, across the ceiling. It stopped right above her, and then the words,
"Now you've seen me too."
A bright, sunny day, the entire Peppa family was on their way to visit Grandma and Grandpa.
"I can't wait to see Grandma and Grandpa,"
said Peppa.
"Dinosaur! Grrr!"
Exclaimed George. They enjoyed a cozy time together, baking cookies. Peppa and George exchanged mischievous smiles.
"Let's explore the basement,"
suggested Peppa. They tiptoed down the creaky stairs into the dimly lit basement. In the corner stood a dusty chest covered in cobwebs.
What is that? A treasure chest?
Peppa asked in surprise. She opened it with a loud creak. Suddenly, dark shadows burst out from inside, forming sinister figures. "Peppa, I'm scared," George said fearfully. At that moment, everything in the kitchen was peaceful and calm. The family was drinking tea when, suddenly, the children's screams prompted the parents to go downstairs.
What's going on, kids?
Asked Mummy Pig. The shadows swirled around the parents, trying to pull them into the chest. Daddy Pig grabbed one of the tentacles that was emerging from the chest.
George, Peppa, back away!
Daddy Pig shouted sternly. But suddenly, one of the shadows struck him, causing him to lose his balance and loosen his grip. The shadows swallowed the parents. Grandma and Grandpa were having a lovely chat in the kitchen, but Grandpa noticed that no one had come back from the basement for a long time and decided to check. Grandpa Pig hurried down the stairs with a serious look on his face.
Inside this chest were the souls of those brave enough to open it. I found this on an old ship,
He said grimly.
It's a curse.
He pulled out an old book from his pocket and began to recite a spell. The shadows taunted Grandpa, whispering incomprehensible words, and he looked frightened.
Grandpa, help us!
Peppa cried out. The shadows started to dissolve, but suddenly George snatched the book from Grandpa's hands and threw it onto the floor. His eyes turned red as if he were under hypnosis. "No more light needed," he declared. The remaining shadows lunged at Grandpa, dragging him into the chest. He struggled but was helpless. Peppa watched in horror as George advanced toward her with tears in her eyes.
What are you doing?
She shouted in fear. With tears streaming down her face, she grabbed the tattered book tightly and held it high.
I won't let you take my family!
She declared to the shadows, her voice trembling but resolute. She recited something she remembered from Grandpa's stories. The shadows screamed and began to vanish. Silence fell over the basement. Peppa and George were left alone, trembling with horror as they realized they had lost their family. At that moment, Grandma was enjoying the taste of her tea and listening to pleasant music, but a feeling of unease disturbed her peace. Grandma Pig appeared at the top of the stairs, looking horrified at what was happening. Peppa and George looked at each other, trembling, speechless from inside the open chest. George decided to look at the stars through a telescope. Suddenly, they noticed a bright dot approaching quickly toward Earth. It turned out to be an unusual spaceship that landed nearby. Out of the ship came strange creatures. Aliens. They were menacing, with sharp teeth, bright eyes without pupils, and long arms with claws. Suddenly, glowing balls flew out of the ship. These were mini aliens circling around. They glowed gloomily and ominously, and their movements were quick and sharp. The aliens approached and whispered something threatening. They wanted to take over the village. Peppa and George were terrified. They couldn't move from fear. One of the creatures extended its long arm toward the piglets and attacked them. Peppa and George tried to escape, but a bright light from the alien ship pulled them upward. At that moment, they thought they would never see Mommy and Daddy again. But suddenly, a strange luminous creature appeared. It directed a beam of light toward Peppa and George. The beam shone brightly and blinded the aliens. They got scared and quickly flew away. Everything became quiet and peaceful again. The starry creature became their new friend, and Peppa realized even the scariest aliens can leave if there is the light of goodness. This is a lost episode that was never aired on TV. It all began on a normal day. Peppa lost one of her baby teeth. "Hooray!" she shouted, "Dad. Now the tooth fairy will bring me a gift." Mummy Pig smiled. "Put the tooth under your pillow, dear. There'll be a surprise in the morning." That night, Peppa woke up The room was dark, but something felt wrong. She heard a crunching sound from under her pillow. When she lifted it, the tooth was gone, but there was no gift either. Only a strange white lump, like it was made of bones. The next day, George complained about a toothache. Then Mummy Pig, then Daddy Pig. They all said, maybe we ate something bad. That night, Peppa woke up again, but not from the crunch. This time, from breathing. Someone was sitting by her bed, a figure, gray, far too tall, with long arms and a grin that stretched ear to ear. "Do you brush your teeth well, Peppa?" it whispered. "You give them to me, one by one, every night." Peppa screamed, but no one came. George was asleep with his mouth open. His front teeth were missing. Mummy was standing in the hallway, smiling. On her cheek, a white patch like bone powder. Peppa ran to the mirror. On her face, new teeth were growing, but not hers. A third row, sharp, wrong. She ran back to the bedroom. Everyone's teeth were falling out, more and more every second, and someone stood in the corner. That same figure, but its face. Oh God. This is a lost episode no one could ever finish. Never-ending day. It all started like any other day. Peppa woke up in her bed. The sun was shining. Mummy Pig called her to breakfast. George was eating cereal. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Everything felt calm. But the newspaper was blank, just empty white pages. Peppa blinked. She thought it was nothing. She went outside. Everything was the same phrases, the same smiles. The next day, everything repeated. Same breakfast, same weather. Mummy Pig started repeating the same words. Breakfast is getting cold. Breakfast is getting cold. Breakfast is getting cold. Daddy sat frozen with a strange smile. George stared directly at the screen, unblinking. Peppa felt time breaking. She opened her eyes one day and saw strangers in her room. They had her face, all of them, and they just stared. She walked to the mirror. Her reflection didn't move. Its eyes were dark, unnatural. Once she saw George writing on the wall with black chalk. Peppa didn't escape, and then the writing vanished. One morning, Mummy Pig stood still, facing the wall. Peppa screamed her name, but Mummy didn't respond. Then slowly, she turned around, and her face wasn't hers. Another day, Peppa opened the front door, but there was no street, just a black wall. Dark shapes began appearing in the corners of the room. They didn't move, but Peppa knew they were watching her. And then, she didn't wake up in her bed. She woke up inside a cardboard box. There was a price tag on her chest, $13.99. Voices outside whispered, "Let's take this one. Give it to the kid." For the last time, Peppa opened her eyes and saw a screen. On the screen, just one line of text, "File successfully deleted." And then there was only black. No Peppa, no day, just silence. It was an ordinary day. Peppa's math teacher, Madame Gazelle, started coming to her house. At first, Peppa enjoyed studying with her. However, after a few days, Peppa became thin and sad. Her parents started to worry.
Peppa, you must eat.
Mama Pig insisted, but Peppa didn't want anything except math.
Please, call Madame Gazelle.
Her parents obeyed their daughter's request. Peppa looked worse and worse. Madame Gazelle sat with her in the room and taught her mathematics. Suddenly, she pulled out a pink stone. Peppa's pupils disappeared, and she floated up as if hypnotized.
"Math is your life, Peppa,"
said Madame Gazelle with a sinister smile. Meanwhile, her parents had no idea what was happening. They were sitting in the living room watching TV.
What an interesting movie,
said Daddy Pig. A few days later, Peppa could no longer walk or talk.
Why isn't she getting better?
Mama Pig asked, wiping tears from her eyes. One day, Mama Pig saw Madame Gazelle smiling menacingly, holding a stone over Peppa.
What is going on here?
Shouted Mama Pig.
Get out of here, Madame Gazelle!
Said Daddy Pig, looking at her with suspicion. The room darkened. Madame Gazelle transformed into a terrible monster that only said one thing.
Math will take over the world. Bow to it.
A cold wind blew. Everything around turned into a tornado of notebooks and numbers. In the morning, everyone sat at the table with crazy faces. They were solving problems while Madame Gazelle loomed over them as if controlling their minds. Peppa found a box in the closet. Dusty. Old. On it was written, "Our home," in childish handwriting. Inside was a tape, a regular VHS, but their family hadn't owned a player in years. Mummy Pig was surprised. Someone must have mixed it up. Let's throw it away? But Daddy Pig said, "I have an old player in the basement. We can watch." That evening, they all gathered in the living room. The screen flickered. The image shook. On the tape, their house, like someone was standing silently, filming. "Strange," said Mummy Pig. "I don't remember anyone recording us." Then, dinner scene. Everyone sitting at the table. Daddy, Mummy, and Peppa on both sides. Two Peppas, identical, both eating. But one of them smiled. Wrong. Suddenly, one of them turned her head and looked directly into the camera. And in the next instant, she was standing in their room. Peppa and George were playing hide and seek. Just like always, George chose a cozy spot, a little further than usual. Peppa was walking through an empty hall. The house seemed frozen in time. George was hiding well, too well. Mommy Pig was washing the dishes, but her movements were a bit slowed down.
Mommy, George isn't coming out.
He always plays like that.
Peppa felt the presence of something supernatural. The wardrobe where George was hiding was now closer than before. George was always nearby, but he wasn't here. The game of hide and seek had long since crossed into another realm. Peppa approached the window. There was George. He was outside, looking at Peppa and trying to get her attention. Turning around, Peppa noticed that George was also inside. She went outside. The yard was empty. The grass was pressed down, as if someone had just left. But now, in the window, there was her, the one who hadn't come out. Peppa decided to go back home. The door creaked as if someone was pulling it at the same time she did. Something in the house had changed, like it was shrinking. The wardrobe remained, but it no longer hid anything. Peppa entered the kitchen. George sat with his back to her at the table. He was waiting, but something was wrong. His face was blurred. He whispered,
You lose. The game was over.
but had it ever really begun? It all started like any other day. Daddy Pig was fixing a floorboard. Peppa, George, and Evie watched. Evie stared into the gap, silent, unmoving, eyes too wide.
Don't go down there.
Daddy Pig said.
Just dust and spiders.
That night, Peppa woke up. Strange lights flickered under her door. She heard soft rustling. At the end of the hall, she saw Evie.
We're waiting.
In the living room, the rug was gone. In its place, a gaping hole. She stepped closer. Creak, crack. A hand grabbed her. She was pulled under the floor, into darkness, cold, whispering, laughter. Then a warped version of Evie's song. Peppa trembled. Evie stood before her, but twisted, taller, eyes hollow.
You came to play.
She whispered. Peppa backed away, touched something. She turned and saw Daddy Pig. His eyes were glowing. She ran. Hands reached out. Faces flickered. Ahead was a light. It was the silhouette of Mummy Pig. She climbed toward the light, and suddenly a white flash. She gasped in bed. In her room, she looked around, panting. Everything looked normal. She exhaled, nervously smiled. But then she looked up. Evie was on the ceiling, smiling.